The smell reached the farm long before the sunrise did. For 7 years, a paper mill dumped mountains of sludge behind a struggling family farm in rural Mississippi. The crops withered, the soil died, and everyone believed the land was beyond saving. But one afternoon, a 17-year-old girl noticed something impossible. A single sunflower was blooming taller than anywhere else, right in the middle of the toxic waste. What she discovered next wouldn't just save her family's farm. It would force the very company that destroyed their land to come knocking on her door. A humid summer dawn settled over the rolling farmland of Yazoo County, Mississippi. The air was heavy, the sky pale with early light, and the wind carried a sour industrial smell long before the sun climbed above the fields. The odor always arrived first, long before the rumble of engines echoed across the valley, before birds dared to sing, before the first rooster greeted the morning. The smell drifted over the Bennett farm like an unwelcome visitor that had forgotten how to leave. It was thick with wet paper pulp, fermented wood fibers, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Clara Bennett stood barefoot on the weathered porch, breathing through her mouth, but even that no longer helped. She was 17 years old, tall and slender from years of farm work rather than exercise. Her chestnut hair was usually tied into a loose braid that never stayed neat for long, and strands escaped constantly around her sunburned face. Her green eyes carried an unusual stillness for someone so young. Friends at school sometimes mistook that silence for shyness, but it came from something much older than fear. Clara had learned, little by little, that disappointment spoke louder than hope. Years of watching adults lose battles they should have won had quietly stolen the carefree laughter most teenagers still possessed. She leaned both hands against the porch railing and watched another convoy of white dump trucks disappear toward the low marsh behind the southern pasture. "They're early today," she whispered. Her family's farm covered nearly 80 acres, though calling it 80 productive acres would have been generous. Nearly a third of the property had become almost useless since the paper mill expanded 7 years earlier. Every rainfall carried strange gray water across the lowest fields. Corn no longer reached shoulder height. Soybeans emerged weak and yellow before dying under the Mississippi sun. Behind Clara, the screen door creaked open. Her father, Thomas Bennett, stepped outside carrying 2 chipped coffee mugs. At 49, Thomas still possessed the broad shoulders of the college football player he had once been, but years of hard labor had bent him slightly forward. His square jaw was hidden beneath a thick salt and pepper beard, and deep lines surrounded calm blue eyes that rarely showed anger anymore. Losing harvest after harvest had not made him bitter, it had simply exhausted him. He had become the kind of man who measured hope carefully because replacing it was too expensive. He handed Clara a mug without speaking. Together, they watched another truck reverse toward the dumping ground. "They'll fill the whole marsh before Christmas," Clara finally said. Thomas answered with a slow nod. "I know. Nothing more." Silence had become the Bennett family's second language. Years earlier, Thomas had written letters to county officials, environmental agencies, even state representatives. He had driven 3 hours to attend public hearings where no one remembered his name by the following week. Every complaint returned wrapped in legal language that sounded polite while changing absolutely nothing. Inside the farmhouse, Clara's mother moved quietly around the kitchen. Sarah Bennett was 45, shorter than her husband by nearly a foot, with soft brown skin weathered by countless summers beneath the Mississippi sun. Her dark auburn hair, once long enough to reach her waist, now rested just above her shoulders after practicality had replaced vanity years ago. She possessed the gentle voice of someone who naturally comforted others, yet grief had slowly taught her to hide every worry behind small smiles. She still believed kindness mattered, even after discovering kindness alone could not stop powerful companies. Breakfast was simple: biscuits, eggs, coffee. Conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. After eating, Clara carried feed buckets toward the old chicken coop. Every step across the yard reminded her how much had changed. She remembered racing barefoot through thick grass as a child, chasing butterflies that floated above healthy fields. Those memories now felt like stories belonging to someone else. Near the fence line she paused. Fresh tire tracks. Another delivery. The trucks never looked toward the farmhouse. Neither did the drivers. It was as though the Bennett family no longer existed. A warm breeze shifted across the pasture, carrying fresh waves of sour air from behind a hill. Clara climbed onto the lowest fence rail and stared toward the distant dumping site, where steam drifted lazily upward from mountains of gray sludge baking beneath the rising sun. Sometimes she imagined the piles were alive, growing, breathing, waiting. She often wondered whether anyone inside the enormous paper mill had ever stood exactly where she stood now. Had they smelled what she smelled every morning? Had they watched crops slowly disappear? Had they noticed how children stopped fishing in the creek because the water no longer looked clean? Probably not. People who signed paperwork rarely visited places where consequences lived. Her thoughts drifted toward college brochures folded inside her bedroom drawer. A science degree had once felt possible. Now tuition seemed as unreachable as another planet. Every failed harvest meant another year of choosing survival over dreams. Still, something deep inside her refused to surrender completely. Not because she believed someone would rescue the farm, because she had finally accepted no one was coming. As another truck emptied its load into the marsh, Clara watched a flock of startled birds lift into the brightening sky. She didn't realize it yet, but somewhere beneath those forgotten heaps of paper sludge, nature had already begun hiding the first clue that would change everything. By the time late September arrived, the endless humidity of Mississippi had finally softened. Warm afternoons followed cool mornings, and gentle rains left the fields smelling of damp earth instead of dust. Yet behind the Bennett farm, the familiar sour odor from the paper sludge still lingered beneath the crisp autumn breeze. Clara had almost stopped looking toward the dumping ground. It had become easier to pretend the gray hills beyond the southern fence were simply another part of the landscape instead of the reason her family's future kept shrinking every harvest. That afternoon, she was repairing broken fence wire left behind after 2 days of rain. Her boots sank into wet soil while dragonflies skimmed over puddles reflecting a pale blue sky. She carried an old hammer in one hand and a coil of fencing wire over her shoulder, following the property line until she reached the oldest section of the dumping area, a place the paper mill trucks had abandoned years earlier after newer dumping sites opened farther west. Rain had flattened much of the aging sludge into uneven ridges covered with patches of stubborn weeds. Then she stopped walking. About 20 yards ahead stood something that made no sense. A cluster of sunflowers. Not one. Nearly a dozen. The tallest stretched almost 8 feet into the air, their thick emerald stalks standing straighter than young pine trees. Brilliant golden petals surrounded heavy seed heads that followed the afternoon sunlight as though they had never known sickness. Around them, the ground remained gray and lifeless. Nothing else survived there. Clara slowly approached, almost afraid that getting closer would somehow make them disappear. She knelt beside the largest flower and touched one broad leaf. It was cool, healthy, perfect. Her heartbeat quickened. "How are you alive?" she whispered. She examined the soil beneath the stems. The sludge no longer looked fresh. Years of rain had darkened it into crumbly layers mixed with leaves, twigs, and patches of black earth. Tiny white threads spread through the surface like delicate spiderwebs. She had never seen anything like them. Instead of finishing the fence, Clara hurried home carrying only a notebook filled with rough sketches of the flowers and the strange ground surrounding them. That evening, she searched the internet using the family's painfully slow satellite connection. Nothing. Most websites simply repeated that paper sludge damaged farmland. But none explained what she had witnessed. The following Tuesday, after school, Clara drove her father's aging pickup into the small town of Yazoo City and parked outside the county library. The building was old enough that its brick walls still carried faint marks from floods decades earlier. Inside, the air smelled of aging paper and polished wood. Behind the front desk sat Evelyn Brooks. Mrs. Brooks was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair gathered into a loose bun and warm brown eyes hidden behind thin reading glasses. She wore simple cardigans regardless of season and possessed the quiet patience shared by people who genuinely loved books more than conversations. Years earlier, she had lost her husband to cancer, and since then the library had become both her workplace and her refuge. She had an extraordinary memory for every shelf inside the building and believed almost every difficult question deserved another book instead of a quick answer. "What can I help you find?" she asked with a gentle smile. Clara hesitated. "I need books about soil." Mrs. Brooks tilted her head. "Gardening. Not exactly. Soil biology? Clara blinked. I didn't know that was a real thing. It is, the librarian answered, already walking toward the agricultural shelves. Within minutes, she returned carrying 4 thick books whose pages had yellowed with age. Soil microbiology, composting fundamentals, regenerative agriculture, the living earth. Mrs. Brooks placed them carefully on the table. If these aren't enough, she said softly, I'll request more from the University Extension Library. For the next several weeks, Clara developed a routine. School, farm chores, homework, then hours spent reading beneath the kitchen lamp after everyone else had gone to bed. The deeper she studied, the more one idea refused to leave her mind. Maybe the paper mill hadn't buried worthless waste behind her family's farm. Maybe it had buried unfinished potential. One rainy October evening, she reached a chapter explaining how enormous quantities of cellulose-rich organic waste could eventually become fertile humus if balanced with nitrogen, moisture, oxygen, and billions of living microorganisms. Clara slowly closed the book. She looked out the kitchen window toward the dark pasture where the distant sludge piles disappeared beneath the moonlight. For the first time in 7 years, she wasn't looking at a problem. She was looking at a possibility. October settled quietly across Yazoo County. The air turned cooler each morning, while the afternoons remained warm enough for crickets to sing beneath fading sunlight. Behind the Bennett barn, fallen oak leaves gathered against old fence posts as Clara prepared for an experiment she intended to keep hidden from everyone except her family. She chose an abandoned corner behind the cattle shed where passing trucks from the paper mill could not see her work. Every afternoon after finishing chores, she wheeled home small amounts of weathered paper fiber from the oldest dumping area instead of the fresh gray sludge. The older material crumbled easily between her fingers, carrying almost no chemical odor. According to everything she had studied, time itself had already begun transforming it. Thomas noticed the wheelbarrow one evening, but asked no questions. He had learned that curiosity could either interrupt determination or quietly protect it. Instead, he simply repaired the broken wheel with a new bearing and left it leaning beside the barn before sunrise the next day. Clara understood the gesture without either of them mentioning it. Following pages of handwritten notes, she layered the aged paper fiber with dry oak leaves collected from the woods, fresh manure from the family cattle, and buckets of creek water. She mixed handfuls of healthy forest soil into every layer, believing the living microbes hidden inside would do work no machine ever could. The pile looked unimpressive, little more than a low mound covered with burlap sacks. But to Clara it felt like planting an invisible crop. The first 2 weeks were discouraging. Nothing happened. The pile remained cold and damp. She checked it every morning before school and every evening after feeding the livestock. Sometimes she wondered whether the books had been written for people with better soil, better weather, or simply better luck. Then came the smell. Not the sour odor from the paper mill. Something worse. A sharp, rotten scent escaped from the center of the pile after several days of heavy rain. Clara dug into the material with a garden fork and discovered soggy clumps where almost no air could reach. She spent the next 4 hours rebuilding the entire mound under a light drizzle, her gloves soaked, her shoulders aching until long after dark. At school the following Monday, the odor still lingered faintly on her jacket. A group of students laughed as she walked past the lockers. One boy exaggeratedly pinched his nose while another muttered, "There goes the recycling queen." Clara kept walking. Their laughter followed her down the hallway, but it sounded strangely distant. Months earlier those words would have embarrassed her. Now they merely reminded her that no one else knew what she was trying to build. That afternoon, someone unexpected stopped beside her pickup before she left school. Coach Daniel Reeves, the agriculture instructor, was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with weathered bronze skin, thick gray eyebrows, and permanently dirt-stained work boots. Before becoming a teacher, he had managed his family's cattle ranch until a tornado destroyed most of it nearly 20 years earlier. Losing that ranch had taught him that rebuilding always began with the soil beneath a person's feet. "I've seen you borrowing every soil book in the county," he said with an easy smile. Clara hesitated before nodding. "You experimenting with something?" "A little." He looked toward the wheelbarrow in the truck bed without pressing for details. "If you ever need an old compost thermometer," he said, "I've got one collecting dust in my workshop." The following Saturday, he left the thermometer on the front steps of the agriculture classroom with a handwritten note that read only, "Trust the process." 3 mornings later, before sunrise, Clara pushed the long metal probe deep into the center of her rebuilt pile. She waited, pulled it out. Steam drifted into the cold October air. The metal was almost too hot to hold. For the first time since the experiment began, she smiled without forcing it. The pile was finally alive. Spring arrived quietly across Yazoo County. Gentle rain soaked the fields through March, and by early April the mornings carried the fresh scent of wet grass instead of winter frost. Sunlight lingered longer each evening as Clara prepared the small test plot that could determine whether months of failure had meant anything at all. She chose a neglected quarter-acre beside an old windmill where nothing worthwhile had grown for years. The soil was pale, compacted, and littered with stubborn weeds that returned every season despite every effort to remove them. Most neighbors had long considered the patch worthless. Thomas watched from a distance while Clara spread the dark compost across the ground. He noticed how different it looked from the gray paper fiber she had hauled home months earlier. It crumbled through her fingers like rich coffee grounds and carried the earthy fragrance of a forest after rainfall. "You made this?" he asked quietly. Clara smiled. "I think the soil made it. I just gave it the chance." Together they worked until sunset, mixing the compost into the exhausted earth before planting soybeans, tomatoes, pumpkins, and sweet peppers. Every seed felt like a promise neither of them dared to speak aloud. The following weeks tested Clara's patience once again. Nothing remarkable appeared. Tiny green shoots emerged slowly, no faster than those in neighboring fields. She worried she had expected a miracle when nature only offered gradual change. Then May arrived. The difference became impossible to ignore. The tomato plants developed thick stems nearly twice the width of ordinary seedlings. Pumpkin vines spread across the ground with deep emerald leaves untouched by the yellow discoloration common elsewhere on the farm. Even after several unusually hot afternoons, the soil beneath the compost remained cool and moist. Thomas stopped measuring success by hope. He started measuring it with a ruler. Every Sunday, he quietly recorded plant height in an old notebook once used for cattle records. By June, the vegetables towered above neighboring crops. Word spread without anyone intending it. Travelers slowed their trucks along the county road. Farmers leaned across the fence pretending to admire the weather while secretly studying the unusual field. One Saturday morning, a silver pickup stopped outside the Bennett property. A woman stepped out carrying a leather satchel filled with notebooks. Dr. Amelia Carter was 38, an associate professor of soil ecology at Mississippi State University. She stood just above average height with athletic posture earned from years of field research instead of office work. Her dark, curly hair rested beneath a faded university cap, and freckles covered the bridge of her nose after countless summers collecting soil samples across the South. Calm, observant, and endlessly curious, Amelia believed healthy farmland depended more on microscopic life than expensive machinery. Losing her grandparents' family farm during childhood had shaped her career, convincing her that restoring soil meant protecting entire communities. "I've heard unusual things about this field," she said politely while introducing herself. Clara led her across the test plot. For nearly 3 hours, Amelia examined root systems, moisture levels, earthworms, fungal threads, and soil structure. She collected samples from several locations before thanking the family and promising to return after laboratory analysis. 2 weeks later, she came back carrying printed reports. "The microbial activity here is extraordinary," she said, laying the papers across the Bennett kitchen table. "Organic matter has increased dramatically, water retention has improved, and the soil food web is healthier than anything I've measured in nearby commercial fields." Silence filled the room. Sarah covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Thomas lowered his head. For years they had listened to experts explain why their land could never recover. Now another expert was telling them exactly the opposite. Within days, Dr. Carter shared her findings during a regional agricultural workshop. Local newspapers published a small article about the unexpected experiment taking place on the Bennett farm. The attention reached farther than Clara expected. One warm afternoon in July, a black company SUV rolled slowly into the driveway. The paper mill had finally come to see what everyone else was talking about. 3 years passed more quickly than Clara Bennett ever imagined. Each spring, the fields surrounding the old Bennett farm grew greener. What had once been dismissed as exhausted ground slowly became dark, loose soil alive with earthworms, fungi, and the quiet work of millions of unseen organisms. The southern pasture, once avoided because of its foul odor, now supported rows of vegetables, cover crops, and native wildflowers that attracted butterflies and honeybees by the hundreds. The paper mill had changed as well, not because of lawsuits, not because politicians forced it to. It changed because numbers were impossible to ignore. After months of independent research, Mississippi State University published findings showing that properly processed paper fiber could dramatically improve depleted farmland while reducing industrial disposal costs. The report spread through farming communities across the state, attracting attention from agricultural cooperatives, environmental groups, and local business leaders. One cool October morning, a convoy of company vehicles stopped in front of the Bennett farmhouse once again. This time, nobody came carrying legal documents. Instead, the visitors carried blueprints. Leading the group was Michael Donovan, the paper mill's newly appointed operations director. 44 years old, tall and lean with neatly trimmed dark hair touched by early gray, Michael possessed the composed confidence of an experienced engineer rather than a corporate executive. Years earlier, severe flooding had destroyed his own family's small farm in Louisiana, an experience that taught him to respect the people whose livelihoods depended on healthy soil. Unlike many executives, he listened longer than he spoke. "I didn't come to buy your idea," he said after shaking Clara's hand. "I came to ask if you'd help us build something better." Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Clara listened carefully as engineers described a proposal to separate reusable paper fiber before disposal and establish community composting facilities throughout the county. She remained silent until everyone finished. Finally, she asked only one question. "What happens to the families living beside your property?" The room became quiet. Michael answered honestly. "They become our first priority." Clara nodded. "Then I'll help." Construction began the following spring. Instead of endless dumping trucks, specialized processing equipment transformed paper fiber into compost feedstock before it ever reached open land. Local cattle ranchers supplied manure. Tree companies delivered shredded branches. Restaurants contributed vegetable scraps. What had once been treated as separate waste streams became one carefully managed recycling system. Thomas often stood beside the southern fence in the evenings watching fewer trucks pass each month. One afternoon, he smiled at Clara and quietly admitted something he had never said before. "I spent years fighting against that place." He looked toward the modern processing facility, standing where mountains of sludge had once grown. "You figured out how to make it fight for this land instead." By the time Clara turned 26, farmers from neighboring counties regularly visited the Bennett farm to learn practical composting methods. She never described herself as an expert. Instead, she walked visitors through the fields, letting healthy soil speak louder than presentations ever could. Children often joined those tours. Clara always handed them a small handful of compost. "Smell it," she would say. Without exception, every child smiled. It smelled like rain, like forests, like life beginning again. During one university conference, a student asked what inspired her to dedicate her life to restoring damaged land. Clara paused before answering. She remembered the gray mornings, the endless trucks, the years when nobody listened. Then she smiled. "Nature never wastes anything," she said. "Only people do. The moment we learn to work with the land instead of against it, almost every problem begins to look like an opportunity." The audience applauded, but Clara barely noticed. Her thoughts had already returned to the quiet farm where everything truly began, not with a miracle, but with a single sunflower that refused to grow where everyone believed life had already ended. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, they begin as a single seed of hope planted in the heart of someone who refuses to give up. Clara believed she was saving a piece of forgotten land. But perhaps God was showing everyone that nothing he created is truly without purpose. In our own lives, we often face broken dreams, difficult seasons, or problems that seem impossible to fix. Yet God can transform what looks like failure into something beautiful when we choose faith, patience, and perseverance. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story. And if you believe that God still works through ordinary people doing extraordinary acts of kindness, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. May God bless you, your family, your home, and every field of your life with hope, peace, and abundant blessings.